Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen at Globus, as well as those of you viewing us live online. Thank you for coming to the Globus Professional Lunch Seminar on this wonderful day. My name is Brian Cathcart from the Globus Student Services Office, and I am excited to be your host for today. Today we are privileged to have with us Mr. Peter Bouckaert, the Emergencies Director for Human Rights Watch. Thank you. The topic for today is World Speaks Out, looking at today's world from the front lines of humanitarian crises. Before we begin, I would like to briefly go over today's agenda. First, Mr. Bouckaert will give his presentation for 60 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session for about 30 minutes where you can ask questions directly to Mr. Bouckaert. But first, we will have the head of the Japan's section of Human Rights Watch, Ms. Kanaya Doi, give a quick announcement. Kanaya-san.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for giving us this great opportunity to talk to you about our work by Human Rights Watch. I am Kanaya Doi, Japan Director for Human Rights Watch. And then Human Rights Watch is a non-government organization which covers 90 countries around the world. We are strictly non-governmental, so we get no funding from the governments, and then we are not aligned to any association in the world. And then we are sending out newses around the world, and then from 90 countries. And then I'm really proud today to introduce Peter Bouckaert, who is the founder and director of the Emergencies Division of Human Rights Watch, because I believe that the Emergencies Division really is the iconic division of Human Rights Watch, and it makes Human Rights Watch a Human Rights Watch. We are really known as a news producer, and then we are very fast in producing news about a crisis when it happens. And Peter has extensive experiences in going into crisis and then reporting what's happening on the ground, even most of the time much quicker than journalists. So I wish that you would enjoy the discussions with Peter. And again, thank you very much for this opportunity. So first, I would like to show a video for about 10 minutes, which describes our work in the past 1 year, particularly on what we did in the Arab Springs. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kanaya. And this video might have some graphic images, but I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
It works this time.
One word that comes to mind when I think of the uprisings in the Middle East this year is an Arabic word, akhiran. Finally, we are seeing people standing up to challenge these authoritarian governments that have been with their foot on the necks of the people for decades and decades. This armor of oppression, this barrier of fear, it just ripped open. It ripped open, and you saw millions and millions and millions of Arabs reaching through, reaching out, overcoming the fear that they'd endured, the suffering they'd endured, with a collective sort of shout that has transfixed the entire world.
The moment I heard that Mubarak had resigned, there was this incredible sense of empowerment that my generation felt.
Listen to that crowd. That's what they've been waiting for. Hosni Mubarak has gone.
This huge cheer went up. It was the most exhilarating experience I've witnessed since I saw the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It's definitely an Arab moment. People are watching. They're learning from each other. There is a domino effect going on.
Dissent in the Arab world is definitely spreading. This time it's hit Libya.
It's finally happened. I don't think any of us would have been able to predict it was going to happen now. These people are clamoring for freedom as they're talking the language of human rights. We have been reporting on human rights abuses in these countries for many years. We understood the background to these uprisings, which were essentially human rights uprisings.
January 28th was a day when they shut down all the communication. The government was refusing to make public any information about how many people had died. So I started trying to get access to hospitals.
Our researchers have already long established contacts in the country, and so it was very easy for us to transition into covering the government's violence against protesters.
We had seen people die in front of us during the protest. We knew that the only way to answer the question of how many people had died was to go to the morgues, so we could give an exact number and names and circumstances. So many of the people who had died had just been shot by tear gas canisters and rubber bullets at extremely close range. They'd just been murdered in the street the day before.
Nobody else had done that groundwork.
We've been working on documenting the number of casualties.
So to come up with a number that the media could rely on and could use and could challenge the government with was crucial.
The government continues to distort or hide the truth about how many people have been killed or detained in the demonstrations. They continue to claim 11 people have died. According to Human Rights Watch, that number is closer to 300. And they got that number by canvassing hospitals in Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez.
During the Egyptian uprising, so much information was coming out from so many different sources. The government might dismiss tweeters or even individual journalists, but when Human Rights Watch provides the research on the ground with the facts and the names and the dates and the details, then it's very, very hard for government to deny.
We were sending that information back to the American government, which has a very close relationship with the Egyptian army. They put pressure on the army to step in and end the violence, and that's essentially what they did. The facts are the bottom line, and President Mubarak is being prosecuted right now because of the protesters who died on that day. Human Rights Watch has never before faced a multitude of crises across such a wide region, but our methodology is the same as our methodology anywhere else. We get as close as possible to the abuses that are taking place.
How close are the tanks inside Misrata?
Why can't we just go and speak to some of the prisoners now?
Our work involves speaking to witnesses and also to the perpetrators, gathering as much evidence, photographic evidence or video evidence, and then we put it all together, we get the information out there to change the situation on the ground. Heba and I arrived at the Libyan border and crossed into no man's land. We arrived in Benghazi just days after the city had fallen. We were investigating massacres of civilians, the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian towns, hundreds of people who had been taken by Gaddafi forces and disappeared.
From what we can tell, and as you know, that journalists are banned, and
Right.
we are relying on reports from Human Rights Watch and other observers, there has been less violence, very little so far in Tripoli, although
The international community was caught like a deer with headlights on it. They didn't have people on the ground in places like Benghazi.
We uncovered the atrocities that were carried out by the Libyan regime in trying to suppress the uprising and then in pursuing the war against the rebels.
The areas which are burned is where the bodies were.
The only people who can tell us what's happening are the eyewitnesses to these atrocities.
Does he know when the bodies were burned inside?
We don't rely on rumor or secondary information. And it's of fundamental importance that we document abuses on both sides.
We found ourselves in constant dialogue with the United Nations, with the US State Department, with the French government, with the British government, telling them not only what was happening on the ground, but what they needed to do.
Were you here when the two bodies came?
Human Rights Watch played a significant role in lobbying for a Security Council Resolution 1970, which referred Libya to the International Criminal Court.
The chamber hereby issues a warrant of arrest for Muammar Gaddafi.
The court sent a very strong message to the core members of the regime that they would be held to account for their actions. And in fact, there were some very high-level defections.
The referral of Libya to the ICC in a scope of 4 days, unprecedented. Without the information that we were able to produce, we would not have seen international action that moved so quickly.
The challenge for anyone working on Syria today is getting access. We had an important advantage. We had been working on Syria for years, had the contacts, had the networks, and more importantly, we had the trust of people inside Syria.
So we did deploy a team to go inside Syria to investigate the violence that had started in Daraa. We also deployed researchers to the Turkish border, to the Lebanese border, to the Jordanian border, to talk to Syrians who were fleeing the country.
We've documented torture by a number of the agencies, state security, political security, military security, particularly the feared Palestine branch of the military security.
There's a lot of information coming. The challenge is to cross-check it and get to the facts.
My name is Nadim Houri, and I'm the senior researcher on Syria at Human Rights Watch. The protesters have used video. They've used their cell phones, their cameras, to capture what is happening and to send it to the outside world in the hope that the international community would put pressure on Syria.
The Syrian government was doing its very best to keep information locked up. Try as they may, we're going to get it. We're going to get it out, and we're going to let the whole world know.
Watchdog group Human Rights Watch interviewed people who'd been detained during recent protests. Some of them, ages 16 and 17, described to the group what Syrian security forces did to them.
Electrocution with cattle prods, beatings, being hung.
We worked incessantly to push the US and the EU to establish targeted sanctions against the Syrian government. They had implemented asset freezes of key Syrian officials, travel bans on key Syrian officials, and sanctions on the oil assets of Syria. These were all incredibly important measures in isolating President Assad and his circle of cronies.
There is no doubt that these sanctions will limit the ability of the authorities to continue financing the repression. President Assad's world is shrinking. One thing is certain, there's no going back to the way Syria was before.
The uprisings, the overcoming of the fear barrier, the challenging of the authoritarian governments, staring down police officers and soldiers with guns, that was the bravest part of the revolution, and it's revolution part one. Part two of the revolution is going to be rewriting the laws of these countries, rewriting the constitutions, restructuring the justice ministry and the interior ministries and the security services of those countries. The big question now is who's next? Which Arab leader is going to be the next to fall? And I think the answer is very simple. They're all next. They're all going to fall because they are standing in opposition to what every human being wants, which is to be treated fairly and decently with their rights and their freedom and their spirit intact.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Mr. Houri for the invitation and also for showing us around on his beautiful campus. It's a very inspiring project that he has been doing for so long. He's also a member of our Tokyo committee, so we also thank him for his support to Human Rights Watch. You may ask yourself, why does Human Rights Watch want to come speak at a business school? And what is your interest in human rights? And I just wanted to start off by explaining that a little bit, because Human Rights Watch is not very well known in Japan. And I think a lot of people think that NGOs like Human Rights Watch are people who stand out on the street with clipboards, maybe collecting signatures. But we're actually an organization with an annual budget of over $50 million. And we're at the cutting edge of professional human rights work, investigations like the ones you see described in the video. And most of our support comes from the global business community around the world. People like George Soros and also the Globus are very involved in Human Rights Watch because they understand the link between documenting human rights violations and creating a stable business environment. As business leaders, it's important that you understand the environments you work in and that you understand the relationship between dictatorial government and human rights abuses and the lack of transparency in these societies, which leads to corruption and an unstable investment climate. So I think that's why so many business people around the world support Human Rights Watch, because they understand that by exposing human rights violations, we actually expose dictatorship and create greater stability around the world. I'm going to give you a brief presentation focusing on how the emergency program started and some of the methodologies that we use in our work. And then I will offer some brief comments about the Arab Spring and our work over the last year and where we think things are going. Some of the slides are a little bit graphic. I know it's lunchtime, so I tried to use as few gruesome slides. But unfortunately, our work is about documenting killings and other very brutal abuses. So I apologize if some of the images are a bit shocking. The first one is probably the worst, so it will get better from there. I started at Human Rights Watch straight after I graduated from Stanford Law School. And some of my first work was in the Balkans. At the time in the Balkans, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing taking place. These are Serbian paramilitaries killing civilians in Bosnia. And at the time, the human rights methodology was still very academic in a way. Human rights researchers would go to the field. They would investigate these abuses. But oftentimes, the reports we were making, they would come out 3 months or 6 months later, and they would be about the overall situation. But when we were confronted with these kind of abuses on the ground, I was coming from an activist background. I was active in the anti-apartheid movement. We felt that it was very important that our work was about trying to save lives, and not just about documenting the killings. We don't live in ivory towers and universities. We live faced with abuses like this. And it's important that we develop a methodology which can actually respond to the needs of the people. So instead of writing these big reports that came out much later about the killings which had taken place, we started doing more focused, smaller investigations about individual massacres, about individual patterns of abuse, deaths in detention, displacement, and putting it out in real time. And immediately, we saw the kind of impact that you saw on the video. CNN, the New York Times, newspapers around the world, the BBC, started reporting on the work of Human Rights Watch in a much more real-time way. And at the same time, we were getting access to policymakers in a much more direct way, because they were also reading the newspapers. So when I started at Human Rights Watch, we had to call the US State Department or the European Union and ask for meetings. But now, today, they are the ones calling us, asking for meetings to get information because they know we're out there in the field. Our work is about documenting human rights violations. This is a picture I took a few years ago in Nepal, and it's of a woman whose husband disappeared during the civil war in Nepal. Human rights abuses don't just happen one day and are forgotten the next day. As you can see in the picture, she's still crying because her husband is missing. Her husband is the main breadwinner in the family. So they are in a very difficult situation. And this was happening thousands and thousands of times in Nepal's civil war. Now, the only two facts we have now is that her husband disappeared. The government will say that he left to join the Maoist rebels to fight against the government. So our work is to go out in the field and to interview the families of all of these individuals to establish what they know about what happened. So we would interview them, and they would say, some men in uniform, in the military uniform of the Nepali army, they came to our house, they took away our son, our husband. Maybe sometimes they went to visit him for a few times at the army military base to bring food, to bring clothes, and then they just disappeared. So based on our investigations, we're able to establish that who is responsible for these abuses, what the pattern of the abuses is. Most of these men are killed. They will never talk again. But for a brief period, 10, 15 days, they were kept in the detention of the Nepali army, interrogated, tortured, forced to give other names of people suspected of Maoist activities, who were then themselves disappeared. So our work involves going out in the field in places around the world to collect this kind of information. And as you can see from this picture, it's not kind of a vacation into the suburbs of Tokyo. We go to some very extreme environments because that's the only way we can collect this information. Here we're in the Central African Republic in Africa, trying to decide whether we should drive over this bridge, which we decided not to do. We drove around into the river. Think of it as a form of extreme camping. Because we had to take all of our fuel around. We went 3,000 kilometers into this country. We even had to eat monkey one day because there was nothing else to eat. We both came down with malaria. But it's the only way we can collect the kind of information we need to establish exactly what's going on. This is right on the border with Darfur, and we heard that villages were being burned all over the place. So we headed out. We ran into the military guys who were the ones who were actually committing the abuses. They asked us for a ride because they had run out of fuel. It was a little bit difficult to take all of them on our car, so we just took one of them. And we also ran into the rebels who were fighting against them. You can immediately see the difference in terms of the kind of arms they have and kind of equipment, numbers they have. But it's important that we're able to meet with these kind of people out in the bush, as we say, because we can also discuss with them and educate them about their obligations to the civilian population. The leader of this group, the guy with the scarf in the middle, was a former teacher. So I asked him, do you recruit any children into your rebel movement? And he said, yes, all of my students have come and they joined us. So I told him, it's a war crime to recruit children. And across the border in Congo, one of your rebel commanders, Lubango, he's just been arrested by the International Criminal Court for using child soldiers. So he couldn't sleep that night. He didn't know about this. His only contact with the outside world was a little BBC radio. He just was not informed. So the next day, he contacted us and said, please, I don't want to go to trial. I don't want to be arrested. Find a way that we can get these children to be released. So we contacted UNICEF. We put them in touch. And ultimately, all of the children were taken from this rebel group, and they were reintegrated. So this is a small action which just resulted out of one meeting. But it meant that hundreds of children were able to go back home and were not indoctrinated into this kind of war. Again, all of our work is based on interviews. Here we're interviewing a man who you can see in this picture, who is a survivor of a massacre. He had his hands tied behind his back so strong, so tightly that the muscles in his arm died because of the lack of oxygen flow. But he was the only witness to this massacre committed in this village. So he was a very important person for us to talk to. It took us 3 days of travel just to get to meet this one person way out in northern Central African Republic. And this is what we found, village after village which was burned. These villages, they don't even exist on the map. So we would arrive, we would just stop our car and wait for the people to come back because they were so afraid from the military. that whenever they heard a car come, they would run away and disappear. And then we would have to ask them what happened in their village, because again, obviously the village has been burned, but we can't say whether it's because somebody threw a cigarette out of the window or because somebody came and actually put the houses on fire. But our reporting and our investigations is only the first step of our work. The important part comes afterwards when we do advocacy work to try to stop these abuses. So here you have the president of the Central African Republic, Francois Bozizé, and Louis Michel, who was the foreign policy chief of the European Union, sitting down after the release of our report. And the French military actually took President Bozizé to Northern Central African Republic to show him the destruction which was being caused by his military forces, burning down the villages. And then the president ordered the Presidential Guard, which were the troops responsible, to withdraw from Northern Central African Republic and to stop this reign of terror. I just want to talk briefly about some of the techniques that we use in our work, in addition to interviewing. Human Rights Watch also does a lot of forensic exhumations. Here we are in Libya last year at a mass grave of people who were executed. And if you look here, you can actually see that his hands are tied behind his back. So we participate in these kind of forensic exhumations for two reasons. The first is to collect the actual evidence of crimes and to make sure it's preserved. Here, the person is taking a skull out of a mass grave and it's blindfolded. So it's obvious that this person did not die in fighting. He was captured, he was blindfolded, and then he was executed. But there's a second reason why we conduct these exhumations. It's also to help reunite the families with their missing people. I think you remember the picture of the Nepali woman who is crying when she showed us the picture of her husband. For families around the world, it's very important that the bodies of those who've been killed are returned to them, and that they can give them a proper burial, that they can bury them with the proper rites so they have some closure. And in many cases, because people are so eager after a war to find the remains of their missing people, they conduct the kind of exhumations that destroy the evidence, both that we need to prosecute these crimes, but also that we need to identify the remains. So here is a man in Iraq actually finding the identity card of his son so he could take his body home and give it a proper burial. Obviously, in Iraq, the people had no experience doing this kind of work, so we had to educate them on how to do this. These are just the bodies that we took out of one mass grave in Iraq. There were 300,000 people killed by Saddam Hussein between 1991 and the 2003 war in massacres. And so we put each body in a bag with the identification information we had to try to reunite them with their families. It's obviously a massive job. And this is what we hope is the end result, people being given a proper burial. Human Rights Watch also uses a lot of satellite imagery. We're constantly thinking about new technologies, about social media, about satellite imagery, and how we can use it to do our work. Here, we're during the 2008 war between South Ossetia, Russia, and Georgia. And this is a satellite imagery of a group of villages on the border. And each of the houses, which is red, is a house which has been recently burned. You can actually see in some of the close-up images houses which are still on fire. Obviously, again, the image tells you something, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And it's important that we combine this with our information from our teams on the ground to interpret what is actually happening in this image. Because, you know, here it could be anybody conducting this destruction. So these is what our teams on the ground found. These are South Ossetian militias in ethnic Georgian villages inside South Ossetia. burning the houses and looting the houses. So taking these two pieces of information together, we had the visual imagery to show the extent of the destruction, but we also had the information on the ground showing that this was a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Now, these South Ossetian militias are controlled by the Russian army. So after we presented this information, Russia stepped in to secure this area and to stop this continued destruction of villages, ethnic villages on the border. So we had an immediate effect with this work. This is a bit more of a complex example of our use of satellite imagery. It relates to the war in the Vani in northern Sri Lanka. As you probably remember, the Sri Lankan army government kicked out all of the international organizations from the Vani region during the final stages of the war, and they claimed there were almost no civilians left in this area and that they were not using heavy weapons in the war. You have two areas here which are dotted in pink. Those are the no-fire zones inside the Vani, where the civilian population had gathered. And using satellite imagery, we were able to establish that up to 300,000 people were still stuck in this area in a density, very high density, almost like Tokyo City, so many people living in a small area. But what we were also able to show through more sophisticated analysis is the firing positions of the artillery and howitzer pieces, the heavy artillery of the Sri Lankan army. So each one of these vectors coming from the red squares is one of the firing positions of the Sri Lankan army. And as you can see, they are shelling directly into these so-called no-fire zones. Up to 20,000 people were killed because of this shelling, but nobody was there to witness it. So in this case, our only evidence at the time, in addition to the people coming out, was this kind of satellite imagery. We think this is very important work because there are some countries like North Korea who prevent Human Rights Watch from gaining access. But by using satellite imagery, we can still tell a part of the story. Together with going to the border and interviewing North Koreans who are fleeing, we can still tell governments that they might be able to keep us out of their countries, but they will not keep us from telling the story about what is happening in their countries. We also work a lot on documents. Here is a document that I found in Libya after the fall of Tripoli. One of the first buildings I went to visit was the headquarters of Musa Kusa's external security organization, Libya's spy agency. So what I found are all of the faxes between the CIA, MI6, and the Libyan government relating to the illegal capture and rendition of opponents of Gaddafi. So what the CIA and MI6 were doing is finding Islamic, not extremists, Islamic activists who fought against Gaddafi in places like Hong Kong and Malaysia. They would capture them with the cooperation of the authorities in these countries and send them back to Libya, where these individuals were tortured. As you can see, this fax relates to the capture and rendition of Abdullah al-Sadek, who is now actually the military commander of Tripoli. He's a big chief in Tripoli. And as you can see, it talks about his capture together with his 4-month pregnant wife with the cooperation of Malaysia and Hong Kong. Us finding these documents has led to an official police investigation by Scotland Yard into the actions of MI6 and whether they violated British law. So just finding these documents has had some real impact in trying to stop these abuses. It also exposed the cooperation of many Asian and European governments that was not previously known in some of these abuses. It's amazing to see just how much some of these Middle Eastern governments, how much surveillance they do. These are phone taps of mobile phone numbers. We found the phone taps for every single embassy that was operating in Tripoli as well. We found the Internet Interception Center, where just about everybody's email was monitored, even satellite email. The Libyans were listening into everybody. They were hacking into Facebook accounts. They were intercepting satellite signals. And they were doing it with the assistance of European and Asian technology. Unfortunately, the technology companies, they also left behind all of their presentations they made to the Libyan government. This system was built by a French company called Amesys, which is a main subsidiary of Bull Technologies, which is the main computer company in France. Now, Amesys is under criminal investigation in France, and Bull Technologies has sold Amesys because of its exposure to negative media generated by our finds. So once again, these are the kind of impacts you have to think about when you're working in business. You have to think about what Human Rights Watch might be able to uncover in Libya or other countries if you're engaged with these kind of governments. And you have to think about the impact of your business practices. People were killed because of this internet interception system that was sold to Libya. And there's similar systems sold to Syria still. I just want to talk a little bit about one final area of our work, which is about weapons. Human Rights Watch is one of the founders of the international campaign to ban the use of cluster weapons and mines because we feel that they have an indiscriminate impact on the civilian population. They pose real dangers to the civilian population. This is a picture I took of one cluster strike in Lebanon. Cluster bombs are small bomblets, kind of like grenades, inside a big bomb. And the big bomb explodes in the air, and it drops all of these little bombs. And all of the craters you see on this building are from the impact of one cluster bomb. The problem is that many of the small bomblets don't explode. So they leave behind what is basically a minefield afterwards. So you may ask yourself, why does Human Rights Watch care about weapons so much? It's because we care about civilians and about children, and we want to prevent them from being hurt. But it's not just about civilians and children, it's also about the global security of our aviation system. This is a rebel car in Libya, and what you can see here, this green tube, is a surface-to-air missile. It's capable of shooting down a civilian airplane, flying as high as 11,000 feet. So any plane taking off or landing is very vulnerable to this heat-seeking missile. There were 20,000 of these missiles in Libya, and thousands of them remain unaccounted for. If they end up in the hands of the wrong people, they will pose a terrorist danger to the aviation industry. And Human Rights Watch, I was the first person to start talking about these missiles, and much of our work over the last year in Libya has been working with various governments about securing these very dangerous weapons. A lot of munitions in times of conflict gets left behind. When you're fighting and you have to flee, it's a little bit difficult to carry these kind of heavy artillery shells around. So what happens is that they're picked up by the wrong people, and sometimes they get turned into car bombs, as they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Gaddafi probably had one of the largest arsenals of weapons anywhere around the world, and much of it was looted during the conflict. I found one warehouse, just one warehouse, with 120,000 landmines, and I saw them loaded into trucks to disappear. And we're already seeing this kind of weapons showing up in other conflicts around the region. I just returned from Mali, which half of Mali is now in the hands of Islamist rebels, some of them linked to Al-Qaeda, who arrived with these kind of weapons to destabilize the government. This is the kind of weapon warehouses that we were finding in Libya. There's probably 100 surface-to-air missiles laying around in this picture alone. And when I sent it to the State Department, I got a call back about 15 minutes later. That's how freaked out they were about what we were finding. And as you can see, people were just coming in and taking away these weapons. At some of these facilities, there were 70 or 100 warehouses like this. I would go there and walk around by myself for hours without seeing any attempt to secure them. Obviously, again, dealing with weapons takes a great level of expertise, and we have to understand what we're seeing. This is a picture that we took over Gaza during the 2009 conflict, and they're not fireworks going off over the city. This is white phosphorus. It's a highly flammable chemical agent, which is used to create smoke screens to hide the movement of soldiers. But the way the IDF was using it was to burst them high up in the air. And what we found on the ground was literally a rain of fire coming down on the civilian population. If one of these hits you, it will burn right through your skin, down to the bone. It's a very dangerous substance. So that's what our work is really about. It's about using these different technologies and skills to try to protect civilians during times of conflict. This is just about the emergencies work. We also have a specialized business and human rights unit, which looks at the practices of extractive industries, such as the oil and gas and gold extraction industries, which looks at practices of child labor in industries such as the cotton industry. We have a women's and human rights unit. We have a children's unit. And we work in more than 90 countries around the world. It's very important to understand that our reporting is just the first step. What we are really trying to do is to change some of these practices and to make our world a better place to live in. I just want to talk very briefly about the Arab Spring. As you saw from the video, I was there for most of the Arab Spring. I was very privileged to be in Egypt on the first day of the protest. And I watched from a mosque as the people came out of the mosque. The police were already deployed. This was in the city of Alexandria. And they raised their hands, said, Salmiya, Salmiya. If there's one Arab word I would like you to remember, it's Salmiya. It means peaceful. And they were immediately attacked by the police, and people were dying in front of us. Now, what are the demands of these protesters? I think for many Japanese people, seeing this amount of violence, it's very intimidating because you don't see this kind of violence in Japanese society. But I think it's important to understand that at the beginning, people did come out peacefully to protest. And the violence was coming from the government side. And even in Syria, after so many people were killed for months and months and months, people still wanted to continue to protest peacefully. They understood that once they started fighting back with violence, that it would just spiral out of control. Obviously, in Syria, we're much beyond that point now, but their predictions were accurate. The violence is spinning out of control. So what are the demands of these protesters? They're very, very basic. They want to live the kind of lives that we enjoy and to have the kind of opportunities that we have. They want to be able to go home in the evening and not worry that a policeman is going to come in the middle of the night and take them away because what they said over a beer with friends about their president. They want to be able to access the internet and not worry about being monitored. For many of them, access to the internet is almost non-existent. And most importantly, I think, they want to be part of a global, open society and economic systems that provides opportunities for them. Because in many of these societies, it's not just an issue of human rights abuses. It's an issue of state corruption, which is linked to the human rights abuses. The human rights abuses is what keeps the system in place. It's what keeps intimidating people and terrorizing people so they don't overthrow their system. But it's not the reason why these systems exist. The reason why these systems exist is because a group of people around the system benefit directly from the system. By having their president in control, they're able to monopolize certain sectors of the economy and reap great economic benefits. But because the system is so corrupt, there's very little innovation taking place. There's very little foreign investment taking place in these countries. So it means there's very little economic growth because so much of the profits from these economies is stolen away through corruption. You can't have economic growth when the profits are being stolen and not reinvested into the economy. So in the end result, it means that many young people like yourselves in these societies are going to university. They're working hard for an education. But when they graduate, there's no jobs available for them because the economy isn't growing. And this is a society where there's many, many young people. So they sit at home being frustrated after having invested all of these years in education. They can't travel abroad. And finally, it came to a point where the humiliation just became too great. They were tired of living without opportunities in their society, while they saw people driving around in fancy cars and living very extravagant lifestyles because of their links to the system. So we're not just talking about trying to overthrow a president and having free elections. Underneath all of this change in the Middle East is a real attempt to change an entire economic system. And that's much more challenging because the people who benefited from the old system were making a lot of money from it. And you have to rebuild an entire less corrupt system. In the case of Libya, with access to incredible resources. Libya has a lot of oil, it has a lot of gas. So the temptation for the new leaders to engage in the same kind of practices as the old leaders and not to create a transparent economic system and political system is very great. So the challenges we face in the Middle East are very significant. These revolutions were unavoidable. There came a stage where for young people with access, some access to the internet, with seeing how other people in the world were living, that they said, we've had enough and we want change. And they stopped believing in the promises of change. You know, Egypt and all of these countries have been undergoing change for decades, but nothing ever changes. So the revolutions themselves were unavoidable, and we can't go back in time. But obviously, the dangers are also extremely great. What we see in Syria right now is an absolute disaster. There was a massacre just 2 days ago of over 100 people, including 30-something children who were shot in their homes by sectarian fighters. And things could get much, much worse in Syria. It could draw in Iran, which is the main backer of Assad. It could spread to Lebanon, and it could draw in Israel. So there are great things at stake. And we have to move both at trying to prevent this disaster from unfolding in Syria, but also to try to consolidate change in some of the societies where change has taken place. We can't just walk away from Tunisia and Libya and Egypt just because the president has changed. There's much work to be done in terms of building institutions. Finally, let me just offer a few brief comments about Japan and its role. I have worked at Human Rights Watch for almost 15 years. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of very courageous Japanese journalists and activists. I was in Burma when the Japanese filmmaker was killed during the monk protest, and I was also in Thailand when the Japanese Reuters photographer was shot by Thaksin's fighters, not by the military, during the Red Shirt protests. So I have a great respect for the Japanese press. And it's great to see that Japan, over those 15 years, has become a lot more engaged on the international level. Japan is now one of the biggest donors to many post-conflict reconstruction efforts, especially in Asia, but also globally. And I think that generosity of the Japanese people is very much appreciated internationally. But I think where things fall short a little bit is that Japan doesn't use the extensive leverage they have. The fact that they're paying for so much in Sri Lanka and Burma to push on human rights issues. I think they prefer to give money rather than to raise some issues which are more controversial related to human rights. They're very uncomfortable saying those tough things publicly. So we have to look very carefully to even find the word human rights mentioned by any Japanese official. And I think that's a shame, because with your financial influence in the region, in terms of the reconstruction work you do, you could be using that capital much more effective if you also raise human rights issues in a more profound way. Because we cannot have effective reconstruction without addressing some of the underlying human rights issues. We can't have a peaceful and stable Sri Lanka without addressing the disappearances which are taking place and the very great tensions between the Tamil and Sinhalese communities which continue to exist. And human rights doesn't always have to be about confrontation. It does have to be about principles. It should start off saying, we disagree that you are putting hundreds of thousands of people in closed camps without access to the humanitarian needs they have in Sri Lanka a few years ago. That should be the beginning of the discussion. But we will provide assistance to meet those humanitarian needs. That's a principled discussion. And by advancing some of those principles as a more important goal of Japanese foreign policy, I think the ultimate investments Japan makes in reconstruction will have a greater payoff ultimately, because you will be investing in more stable societies. So I'll stop there, I think. I'm a few minutes early, so you will have to ask 5 minutes of extra questions. But thank you very much for listening to me. Mr. Hori. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Buko, for the inspiring speech. My name is Yusuke Taguchi. I have a question. What was the driving factor that made you to work in this field? And what is it that keeps you motivated to work here? Because I'm sure that working in such a field exposes you to extreme danger, and not only yourself, but maybe sometimes your family too. And I'm personally very interested in these things because in the future I would like to work in such a related field myself.
Thank you. You know, I wanted to live a meaningful life, and I went to one of the top law schools in the US, Stanford Law School. I could have chosen many different career paths, but I chose to work on human rights issues, partly because it was just the career path I followed. I went to South Africa to work for Nelson Mandela's lawyer while I was in law school, and it was a natural progression from there. But I find it an incredibly intellectually stimulating and challenging career. For each project I take on, I have to come up with the methodology which will be most effective. And I have to come up with the advocacy strategy which is the most effective. So I'm constantly thinking, and I like to have those challenges. You know, we had a very difficult situation with the Sri Lankan government, who refused to listen to any foreign country, any international pressure about the very serious human rights abuses they were facing, they were committing. So we were talking about advocacy strategies. And we said, maybe we should go to the IMF because Sri Lanka is going to go ask for a multi-billion-dollar loan and see if we can get the IMF to delay the loan. And people said, well, the IMF is a bank. It's not going to get involved in these kind of issues. The IMF, the vote is controlled by the countries which contribute to the IMF. And many of these countries, they were frustrated because Sri Lanka was not engaging on the issue. So we actually went to those countries and asked them to tell the IMF, we're not ready to approve this loan. And finally, the Sri Lankans were forced to listen because there were billions of dollars on the table. They could no longer ignore. So it was that kind of, we work in this kind of stimulating environment where you have to do the thinking for yourself. Of course, we are exposed to dangers, but you have to understand, we arrive in these places when people are living through the darkest periods of their lives. Sometimes they've lost everything. Sometimes I meet people, their whole families were killed the day before. Sometimes they've been raped. Just really horrible experience. And the fact that we show up and we're there to say, we care, we want to know what's happening to you, and we will try to do something to stop it, makes a tremendous amount of difference in their lives. And it's that look in their eyes of appreciation and respect, which I think keeps us going. Because we see the impact of the work. I talk about the atrocities, but I also feel the gratitude of the people that I work for, and I see the difference we make.
Was it by chance that you were able to have a chance to work with Mr. Nelson Mandela's lawyer?
No, you know, I arrived at Stanford Law School from an activist background. I had already been busy in the anti-apartheid movement. So I went to the Career Center because every summer we can do like an internship. And I said, okay, I'm human rights interested. What can you tell me? They said, we can't help you. All of our people, they come here because they want to go into business or corporate law. We don't have a human rights career counseling. So I had to look myself to find a position. I had to go to the library and find out all the organizations working in South Africa, and I wrote a letter to them. And finally, I had this organization responding to me. But now, Stanford, 10 years, 15 years later, they have a good human rights program. But back then, they didn't. Sorry, you had to. Oh, sorry. I thought you were.
Mr. Booker, I heard someone tell me a very plausible sounding story about the uprising and the Arab Spring, that CIA agents were involved actively but surreptitiously to overthrow the government in order to apparently to promote the U.S. government interest. And that made me think, I must have been stupid. I must have been in the dark. I must have been naive to believe what the media had to say. Would you comment on that?
Yes. You know, the Arab governments which were under pressure certainly tried to say that this was all a foreign plot. It's not their own people protesting against them. It's foreign governments trying to overthrow them. And they got a little bit confused because they said it was the CIA one day, then the next day it was Iran, the next day it was Saudi Arabia. Everybody was against them. And I actually wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine about this issue, so you can read it. The truth is that the American government did not want to see Mubarak go, because Mubarak was central to their policy of having a stable Middle East, which was not threatening to Israel. And they had made a deal for many years with Mubarak. He received billions of dollars a year from the US government to promote this artificial situation at the cost of great human rights violations against his own people. And the American government was very afraid of what would come after Mubarak and what it would mean to the peace process and to stability in the region. So their first plan was to promote Omar Suleiman, the vice president, as the next president of Egypt. So I don't think it's true that, certainly I'm sure the CIA was watching very closely what was happening, but these are revolutions which were organized by the people, and oftentimes against what the West wanted to happen in these countries. The West, they were very happy to continue with the situation the way it was. Yes.
Thank you very much. And my name is Yuki Kitazumi, working for Nikkei as a journalist. And I want to ask you about your methodology. It is very similar to the investigation which a newspaper is doing, and it is sometimes recognized as illegal thing to investigate. The government don't want to do it, and so my question is what do you? We are trying to be legal to investigate something, but it is sometimes difficult.
Yes.
So my question is, do you have any code about your activity and between your activity and local regulation or local law that the government made?
Yes.
Thank you.
On the first part of your question about similarities between journalism and human rights monitoring, I think there are some similarities in methodology, but most of the journalism, the media now, they do not have the resources to do the kind of investigative work that Human Rights Watch is doing. I'm sure if you ask your newspaper editor, I want to go work for 3 months to do one story, he will say, no, you need to have a story in the paper every day. And this is one of the great changes which is taking place in the international media. Great newspapers like the Washington Post have gutted almost their entire foreign correspondence bureaus. They simply can't afford it anymore because the loss of revenues is just too great. So it has created a vacuum where Human Rights Watch has become a more important organization on the ground because BBC and CNN and newspapers, they rely on us more for our investigative information. And I think there's a lot of jealousy from areas of the media that we have the privilege, the capacity to conduct these very in-depth investigations. Because, as a journalist, you can quote somebody saying, the official from the Syrian opposition said 150 people were killed, or said that cluster bombs were used in Sri Lanka. But Human Rights Watch, we investigate, and when we publish, we would have to know the names of those 150 people. We want to make sure it's not just a claim, but it's what we found. So this is a big difference in terms of what we actually do, because our reputation for establishing the facts is very important. Regarding to the legality of the work of Human Rights Watch, we try as much as possible not to violate any laws in our work. But at the same time, we will not allow governments to ban us from doing our work. So I went into Burma several times, but I did not say I was there for Human Rights Watch. So normally, I was there for a medical organization to sell prosthetics. And luckily, nobody asked at the customs to show my wares because I didn't have. But, we do have to take some steps like this to do our work. We have to go into Syria sometimes without permission. And this exposes us to some risk. But I think the alternative is to give governments a veto power over the work of Human Rights Watch. And we believe it's part of human rights that we have the right to monitor the rights of other people around the world. Luckily, most of the time when we get detained for being in a place without permission, we get expelled, we don't get put on trial. because the international community in general supports the work of Human Rights Watch, but we take great steps to avoid violating any laws during the work of Human Rights Watch.
For moving stories, and I would like to ask you, what is the take on the contribution as individual for Japanese people? Because you were very, I think you're very nice and polite about the contribution of Japanese government, but if you want to be more critic with Japanese individual contribution, you can do it first. And secondly, are there any list of those black companies which I could make contribution of making voices? Thank you.
You know, I think our first objective is to make the Japanese people more informed about the work of Human Rights Watch, because we see ourselves as a resource to the Japanese people to also learn more about the situation in the rest of the world. One thing I've seen in the last 15 years I've worked at Human Rights Watch is Japanese people are traveling a lot more. They like to go to some of these places. You have many famous Japanese conflict reporters. So there's definitely a greater interest among young Japanese people about the rest of the world. Because, you know, Japan, compared to many other countries, is relatively isolated. Not a lot of people speak English. And it's difficult even for Japanese people to travel abroad when they don't have the language skills. And I see this with Japanese journalists as well. You know, when we're in a conflict area, all of the journalists are together, but the language we speak is English. So the Japanese journalists, they don't always feel comfortable, and so they're more isolated. So I think some of the things we can do, English language skills are very important, and it's important to promote good English language skills in Japan as a way to greater engagement. And a university like this is a very special place in this sense because it is a very international environment. And you have an opportunity to interact more with different cultures than many other Japanese do. But then the next step for us is also to try to get you to teach other people about Human Rights Watch and to get other people to understand it's a useful resource. And ultimately, we hope that that will lead to, you know, we have many influential Japanese people from business, but also from different areas, entertainment area. Who's the dancer who's coming to our annual dinner? Yeah, so, yeah, so we hope that those individuals will also speak with the Japanese government to try to encourage them to do some of the things we would like to do, them to do. And, you know, it's also to writing op-eds in the newspapers. You can also write an article in the newspaper about your views on Burma or something else to promote our work. Because, you know, it involves, our supporters, it's not just about donating to Human Rights Watch, it's about participating in the work of Human Rights Watch. We don't have a complete blacklist because, you know, this is not our business. We focus on specific areas of where companies work. So, for example, we will do a report on the use of children in unsafe working conditions in gold mining in Mali. But we can't give you the list of all of the gold companies around the world which are engaged in abuses. It's just too big. And this is some of our most dangerous work relates to these issues. You know, if you want to expose yourself to danger, just go investigate like illegal logging in Indonesia, for example. It's very dangerous work.
Thank you. My name is Johannes. I came from Ethiopia.
And I want to ask about the effects of the human rights. I've seen many good effects from the human rights intervention, but sometimes it will have negative effect also. For example, in my country, around 2005, there was some uprising, and after that uprising, the human rights report was released, and it was bad for the government because many funds were blocked from the European Commission, and the effect on the people was more harder because it becomes difficult. There was many private newsletters. Every newsletter stopped because these journalists are reporting for the human rights, and it's difficult to get a job. You need to be party member. We can be party member, but we need to pay like 10% of our salary for the party, and it's difficult to get engage in business activities. We need to have that card, so it has a negative effect on the government, on the people. So we become more even closed for the outside world because there was no internet even for 2 years after that. So what's the human rights reaction for this kind of things? And another question about the weapons. So still about cluster bomb I've seen, and still these cluster bombs are used in Africa. In my country also there are these cluster bombs. We don't have that technology, but we are buying from outside world. So still these companies are working, it means. So what's
on your first question, I think I will ask you the question. Is it Human Rights Watch who's shutting down the newspaper, or Meles Zenawi? It's the government of Ethiopia which is shutting down the newspaper because people are discussing human rights problems. So it's not Human Rights Watch which is creating negative problems for the Ethiopian people. It's the Ethiopian government, which has been one of the most hostile governments to Human Rights Watch, I should say. And the reason why aid was withdrawn from Ethiopia is, first of all, because a lot of opposition activists were put in detention, but also because Zenawi's government was using the aid in a politically motivated way. He was giving assistance to the communities which were loyal to him and denying it to communities which had problems with the government. So if you want to get international assistance, you have to play by the rules. And unfortunately, the Ethiopian government has not been doing that. And while Ethiopia has made significant achievements in the economic arena, it's one of these situations where its human rights problems and political repression are really holding the country back. I think ultimately it's the responsibility of the Ethiopian government to address its human rights problems and not to complain about the price it pays from the international community for committing these violations. About cluster bombs, there is an international treaty to ban the use of cluster bombs, but not every country is part of this treaty. And when countries join the treaty, it means not only that they can't use cluster bombs, but also that they can't sell cluster bombs. But there are still many countries outside the treaty, including the United States and Russia. And there were many countries whose arms companies sold off their cluster bombs just before the treaty came into force. So, for example, Spain joined the cluster bomb treaty, I think it was in early 2008. And in 2007, the Spanish munitions company sold many of its cluster bombs to the Libyan government. So we saw them used during the conflict in Libya last year. And what we are pushing for is for stronger control at the level of the European Union, because many arms dealers are companies are in Europe, to control the export of weapons. So that licenses have to be given before you can sell weapons to a government like Syria, for example. Because we found during our research in Libya in particular that many Belgian and Spanish and other European countries were selling vast amounts of weapons to Libya even a few years ago. But of course, the problem with that strategy is that you don't include some of the other arms dealers. China also sold many, many weapons to the Libyan government, including very dangerous weapons, like also possibly cluster bombs, although we don't have 100% identification yet, but there is a cluster bomb we found, which we believe is of Chinese origin, and anti-tank mines. So it creates a problem globally when there are powers like China, which fall outside of this regulatory system, and which are not necessarily willing to play by the same rules. And we could face the same problem when we're talking about the regulation of internet surveillance technology. There always will be a few countries in the world who are staying outside the regulatory system, and which may then have business opportunities for their companies to engage in this kind of activity. And that's often the response we get when we try to put in place these regulatory systems, saying European companies will say, you're disadvantaging European companies unfairly by preventing us from engaging in these kind of businesses, when other companies will then fill the gap and step in.
It's my great pleasure to listen to you in person, and also the president of Human Rights Watch Japan, Ms. Kanae Doi. Thank you very much for your talk. And I'm seeking a career in a development and post-conflict field. You mentioned that the mission of Human Rights Watch shouldn't be to overthrow the presidency, but to consolidate the change. So if that means the Human Rights Watch is keen on participating in the nation-building effort, and if that's so, what kind of role can Human Rights Watch play in the field of reconstruction era, rather than an emergency happening? And also, who would be the best partner you can collaborate with on ground?
Just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, Human Rights Watch is not engaged in the overthrowing of presidents. We're engaged in all of these places we work. Our role is to monitor the abuses committed by all sides. You know, in Libya, for example, we also focused on the abuses committed by the Libyan rebels against African migrants, some massacres that were committed by them. We got them to make a commitment not to use landmines in Libya. So it's very important to understand that we're like the referees and not the instigators in some of these situations. On the issue of reconstruction, there's a very important role for Human Rights Watch to play in the area of justice and accountability and reconciliation. And those concepts, they're interrelated because it is important that there is justice for the victims, that the people who are responsible for the major crimes are held accountable, that we don't have war criminals living out a comfortable retirement, but also that there's reconciliation, because otherwise these wounds fester and they lead to renewed conflict. So what we saw in Libya, for example, is the city of Misrata, which is in the center of Libya, it was subjected to a very brutal siege. It was bombed for months and many, many people were killed. So after the war, they refused to allow people from other towns like Tawerga and Tomina, Kararim, to return to their homes, because they said, you were with Gaddafi, you were the loyalist, and you're the ones from your villages we were being shelled, and you're responsible for the abuses. Those people are still not in their homes, and their towns are being destroyed. So that's vengeance. It's punishment of entire communities, and we're trying to push for reconciliation. while at the same time those who were responsible for the shelling should be held accountable. And obviously we've been working in a lot of countries, so we bring advice about how to restructure the police, how to work towards a more open press, what kind of laws should be amended, so you can have a more democratic and open system. Because you have to reconstruct a lot of this from the ground up. And to also advise the development community about how they can advance human rights in their work. Because oftentimes they say that they're human rights focused development, but they ignore the human rights part of the equation.
Just a little question. So if you talk to like a security sector reform, you directly talk to the government authority or through some international organizations or diplomatic corps?
No, we talk to all of them. We talk directly to the Libyan authorities about a lot of these issues, also about transparency and oil sales and elections. But we also meet with the international community and say, when you're restructuring the police force, you have to make sure that the people who were in charge of torture yesterday are not reappointed tomorrow. So we give them the list of some of the names that we've identified as problematic people as well. Thank you. Just one last.
Hori-san. Thank you, Peter, for your speech. Human rights issues tend to be used politically. Sometimes it's used for the benefit of the country to force some other country to change the course for the national interests of other country. Sometimes it is disregarded or neglected for the benefit of the relationship. You have touched upon the countries like the Middle East and also some of the relatively weaker nations in Asia or Africa. But there are some other countries like China or Russia in terms of human rights watch issues. How active are you in those like politically strong countries, and what are your efforts being done for those countries?
Thank you, Hori-san. It's a good question. And it's a good note to end on because I'm focused mostly on our conflict-related work, but our work on China and Russia and also on the United States is as extensive as the work on those countries. And it's very important for us that we work on the issues in those countries. We were very active during the period of the global war on terror about exposing the issue of torture and the use of torture by the United States. But we also work on a lot of domestic issues in the United States. We work on prison conditions. We work on local policing issues. We did a big report on the use of rape kits in the US, where the police, after a woman is raped, they make her undergo a very intrusive medical exam, but we found that in Los Angeles they never actually used the evidence collected. So I do think we have a very globally balanced program. It's become a lot more difficult in Russia. They have made a lot of obstacles for all international organizations and local organizations working through regulatory procedures because they're very unhappy about Human Rights Watch exposing many of the abuses being committed. China poses a very interesting challenge. And you know, when the Olympics were taking place, there were great debates about whether Human Rights Watch should support a boycott of the Olympics or whether we should urge participation. And we saw the Olympics as an opportunity to raise some of the very profound issues related to China's human rights record. So we briefed a lot of journalists about the kind of questions they should be asking about the human rights concerns that we have in China. And we urged them to use the invitation they had to go to China to cover the Olympics to also discuss some of these human rights issues. And you know, we're very close to Ai Weiwei and many of the other activists who try to improve China's human rights record. And I think there's some interesting developments taking place in China. The work of human rights activists is greatly frowned upon by the Chinese government, and they face incredible repression. So Chinese activists themselves have looked for other opportunities to raise the same issues, because at the basis of it, it's really about accountability of government. So they have focused a lot more on environmental issues, on issues of forced displacement, corruption, the rights of the disabled people, which is much more difficult for China to attack them or arrest them on, because they have very strong support from their own communities. And I think the ingenuity of some of the Chinese activists and also of the Burmese activists, certainly it was very important in opening up Burma to the extent, the little opening which has taken place, was the ingenuity of the activists to look for safer ways to raise their issues. And in Burma, what I found when I went after Cyclone Nargis is that the military junta was completely ineffective to respond to the cyclone. So it's the activists who went down to the delta to help people with the burial of the bodies, but also with the reconstruction of their communities. So it showed people that there was a better way of governance, which I think is really a seed of what is happening today. It's not the junta opening up voluntarily, but really the activists who have shown a better alternative way to the Burmese people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of today's event.
Thank you.